All communities divide themselves into the few and the many. The first are the rich and well-born, the other, the mass of people. The voice of the people has been said to be the voice of God. And however, generally, this maxim has been quoted and believed. It is not true. The people are turbulent and changing. Give therefore to the first class, the wealthy and well-born, a distinct, permanent share in the government. Nothing but a permanent body can check the imprudence of democracy. Alexander Hamilton, founding father, in response to Shay's rebellion, or during the Constitutional Convention. Good morning, y'all. This is a Wandering Author, reminding you that we're all the authors of our own lives. Today, I'm in the Salem Highlands Woods on the north side of Boston, Massachusetts. We're generally traveling down towards Cape Cod National Seashore, where we're going to splash, laugh, and have a blast. And today we're going to finish up discussing Shay's rebellion, its aftermath, and consequences. Yesterday, we talked about leading up to Shay's rebellion. There was a wave of, basically a foreclosure wave on poor farmers, kind of like what happened after 2008, but this was 200 years ago. And in response, back then, because many of these farmers were Revolutionary War veterans, they began arming themselves, heading to the courts, and forcing them to shut down. As this wave of social unrest grew, our nation's former revolutionary leaders, such as Sam Adams, began to shift their tone, turning against the people who fought to liberate the country. As a result of this, there were some concessions made, but first and also, not everybody in the government was against him. Thomas Jefferson, if you remember, I ended my video yesterday with a quote from him expressing some support. Here, let me refresh you on that one, and we'll go through the aftermath as well. But yeah, so Thomas Jefferson says that, "Oh yeah, I hold it that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing. It is a medicine necessary for the sound health of government. God forbid that we should ever be 20 years without such a rebellion." So Thomas Jefferson saw it. However, Sam Adams created the Riot Act in response to all this, which suspended habeas corpus, making it legal to jail people without trial. But yeah, so despite Thomas Jefferson's tacit support, our nation's powerful and wealthy worried that the example set by Shay's rebellion would spread. And they began to react. That's why they call it reactionary politics, right? One of George Washington's generals, General Henry Cox, founded the Order of Cincinnati to watch out and subdue future potential unrest. His letter to Washington betrays the inner thoughts of the country's elites at the time, and this one's pretty funny. So this is quoting, "The people who are insurgents have never paid any or but very little taxes, but they see the weakness of government, they feel at once their own poverty compared with the opulent and their own force, and they are determined to make use of the latter to remedy the former." So what they're saying is the poor people began to realize that they outnumbered the wealthy, and they were starting to use that power. And it was making the wealthy and powerful very nervous at the time. Now, this right here is only 10 years after the Revolution. So we have soldiers that literally fought, poor soldiers, people that are being foreclosed on their farms now. And they're going against the government, and they're winning in many cases. Alexander Hamilton, again, I opened the video with that quote. So, during the Constitutional Convention, Alexander Hamilton's suggestion was to appoint lifetime presidents and senators, not elected by the people like they are today. And he actually got his way on that. So, not the lifetime part, but they were appointed. So although the original Constitution fell short of Hamilton's desires for lifetime appointments, it did not provide real democracy until later. So we had the way that it worked before. Initially, only members of the House were directly elected, and voting requirements were set by state legislators, barring many from voting. So the state governments, they set the requirements for if you were able to vote, and in those requirements were property requirements. Basically, if you were too poor, you couldn't vote. And many of the people who fought in the Revolutionary War discovered that the country they fought to, like for the Declaration of Independence, wouldn't let them vote in it. A lot of them, actually. Senators were also appointed directly by state legislatures. Presidents were elected by state legislature. Supreme Court justices, and I think this is still true today, were appointed by the president. There has been some talk about making it where we can directly elect them, but I think the president still appoints Supreme Court justices currently. And so this brings us back in time to the very ratification of the Constitution. There was a dichotomy of power. Basically, there was wealthy people and poor people, and these people, like, not to say that it's good or bad, that's just how the world is, and everybody has their own self-interests, right? No matter who you are, you have your own self-interests. So during the debates, the way that the Constitutional Convention was run was 9 out of 13 states had to ratify what they agreed on. During these debates, the Federalist Papers entered mainstream circulation over ratification and show us key insights into the nature of conversation. So the Federalist Papers are a series of documents released by people who wanted a strong federal government. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, these guys all supported adoption of the new Constitution, and in Federalist Paper number 10, Hamilton argues representational government is a necessity in a society ridden with factional disputes resulting from, quoting, the various and unequal distribution of property. So he felt like a representative government could help prevent conflicts in a society where he knew there was unequal distribution of power and wealth. So at least they were self-aware back then, right? For Hamilton, the main issue at stake with the Constitution was potential conflict because of wealth disparities. He believed a large federal government would prevent those without property from seizing it from the rich. That he says this, so, and this is more quotes, an extensive republic would, in his eyes, make it will be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and to act in unison with each other. This is Alexander Hamilton in Federalist Paper number 10. Let me repeat this. It's 17th century English. It will be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and to act in unison with each other. The influence of factious leaders within their particular states may kindle a flame, but will be unable to spread a general conflagration through the other states. So what he's saying is if like poor or oppressed people, back then there were actual slaves too, and there were also indentured servants, those guys wouldn't be able to band together in large enough numbers to take over the entire federal government if they had a strong federal government. Remember, they're debating whether they should have a strong federal government or not at this point. And that leads us to the question, what is the purpose of government? And this right here is from me. Is a government, is it just supposed to protect order? It's the status quo? Is it supposed to, what is it, like, is it supposed to actively uplift and empower everybody? That's personally what I think government should be for. But I believe we haven't seen anything like that in many, or most, if not all, human cultures. None that I've studied so far, really. James Madison adds further in Federalist Papers number 10, a rage for paper money, for abolition of debts, for an equal division of property, or for any other improper or wicked project will be less apt to pervade the whole body of the Union than a particular member of it. So again, James Madison, another of our founding fathers, is saying that the regular folk, the working class, won't be able to get paper money instituted. They won't be able to do anything like with the government to abolish their debts or to divide their property if it was a large union. So again, I like the Constitution, but we still have to maintain a proper perspective. When we consider the self-interest of those who wrote the Constitution, we see that power never concedes anything willingly, which is just like what happened in Rome during the conflict of the orders. They didn't start letting the plebeians vote or participate in the government until they basically left the patricians out to dry and had a general strike where they seceded to the Mount of the Moon whenever they were about to be invaded. Anyways, I've gone over that in other videos. It's very similar, and it's a pattern that repeats in other cultures too. And then finally, Hamilton directly calls out Shay's rebellion in Federalist Papers number 10. saying the Union would repress domestic faction and insurrection, adding the tempestuous situation from which Massachusetts has scarcely emerged evinces that dangers of this kind are not merely speculative. Again, 17th century English can be hard to understand, but what Hamilton says is uprisings of poor people whenever the banks are repossessing their property aren't just an imaginary problem. They actually happen, just like what just happened with Shay's rebellion in Massachusetts. So they're talking about, how do we respond to this? And only so let's take a quick survey of, like, if a representative government is supposed to represent its people, who made up the United States at the time that the Constitution was written? Well, it turns out that only about 1/3 of Americans owned any property at the time of the Revolution. And that's just among the males. Half of, females generally didn't own anything. But the Constitution did give enough to the middle class and business owners at the time that most of them supported its ratification. The new government's popularity soared after the passage of the Bill of Rights, showing some concessions from the elites. As a result, the language of freedom and liberty were intertwined with governance for the first time in history. So now this is a little nuanced, so bear with me while I try to clarify the point here. But the Bill of Rights and Constitution as a whole sound, look, and read like benevolent documents until you ask who the arbiter of them is. For example, the Constitution guarantees the execution of legal contracts, which is genuinely important, but consider the power balance whenever any contract is signed. Generally, it's in favor of the most powerful person. Think about landlord versus tenants, creditors versus debtors, employers versus employees. Generally, the one with more power has the advantage when it comes to contracts. And in our Constitution, the government, one of the powers it has is to enforce the fulfillment of contracts. So most of the time, a contract's language is written to favor the more powerful party. And now, let's finish this with a couple hypocritical moments. Even when our government does great things, like pass the First Amendment, it can be pretty hypocritical sometimes. So, passed in 1791, the First Amendment promised that Congress would never pass any laws, quoting, abridging the freedom of speech or press. And again, remember, the Bill of Rights is passed in response to the growing civil unrest from people like Shay and Luke Day and other people that are rebelling against the newly formed revolutionary government. However, 7 years after the first Bill of Rights, the one about freedom of speech, is passed, John Adams' administration passes something called the Seditions Act. So the Seditions Act of 1798 made it a crime to say or write anything, quoting, false, scandalous, and malicious against the government, Congress, or the president. And even though this clearly violated the First Amendment, 10 Americans were imprisoned, and every member of the 1798 Supreme Court held it as a constitutional thing. Man, bad stuff. Our nation has some black marks on its record. But again, I genuinely support it. And then another example is the unfair enforcement of taxation. So another early example of hypocrisy happened when Alexander Hamilton enacted the whiskey tax, unfairly harming small farmers who depended on whiskey for their income. The reason he passed this was to repay war bonds in full, which were mostly held by a small group of wealthy investors. So he taxed poor farmers to pay back his wealthy buddies. I mean, I can kind of understand why he did it, but still. When farmers rebelled against the whiskey tax, and they did, they grabbed arms and they started marching, in 1794, Hamilton personally led troops against them. And he succeeded in, turning them around at the very least. And then, and we'll go into this one later. In another, we may even make a whole other series about central banks, but Hamilton also establishes the first central bank, the first bank of the United States, and set up tariffs. So, what are my takeaways today? From our nation's earliest point in history, it's been beset by social conflict, and that is the same in any nation. Because we're all individuals, each individual has their own self-interest, and everybody is in different circumstances, right? So governments, one of the reasons government exists is to balance these social forces. Another one is, since time immemorial, governments are only as good as humans, which is, as we all know, humankind is rather infallible. So some provisions are enforced strictly while others are neglected. They passed the First Amendment guaranteeing freedom of speech, then arrested 18 Americans on the Seditions Act. And then, but they did the revolution because of unfair taxation, and then they passed the whiskey tax and unfairly taxed farmers. So ultimately, our founding fathers are just as human as anybody that's alive today. But that's all I've got for you guys. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about neuroscience. I'm not quite sure what topic yet, but I think we'll go into the default mode network and probably the major neurotransmitters and how they regulate mood, affection, and intellect, cognition. Anyways, coming at you from the north side of Boston, Massachusetts in the Salem Highland Woods. This is a wandering author reminding you that we're all the authors of our own lives. As always, my message remains the same. Spend less, live more, earn your freedom with reality. What are you guys doing to inspire, uplift, and empower your community today? Because this world isn't changing unless we all do our part, and you can count on me to do mine daily. Until next time, I love y'all.